All right, good. Then we're ready to go. Yeah, thanks for that introduction. Like JJ said, I'm in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, and we've had horrendous weather for Texas and rolling blackouts. Fortunately, I've just had kind of low water pressure in my house, but the electricity is on, and knock on wood, it's going to stay on through the presentation. Um, and as JJ had said, I had written a book called Ambitious Honor, and it reflects what I think are the two sides of Custer. He actually has many facets to his personality, but he was a very ambitious guy, and he was driven, I think, by kind of an artistic sensibility, an artistic temperament, where he wanted to create and wanted to share stuff that he created. And he also had a deep sense of honor. He was raised in Jacksonian America with a deep sense of patriotism and the idea that the United States was the best country in the world. And he went to West Point and actually served the United States for his whole life. That was his career. And the cover of the book is a little bit different from covers that you might have seen from a lot of other Custer imagery. There's not a picture of Custer, waving a sword over his head or something like that, but instead it's a picture of him writing in his office at Fort Abraham Lincoln. Custer was a successful author. He wrote many newspaper articles, and he had a best-selling book at the time of his death, and was working on another one. And so that, as a journalism professor myself and a former newspaper reporter, I found that a really interesting aspect of his character. And I appreciate what Andrew had said in his introduction about, why talk about Custer, why write another book about him? And actually, my biography is not the only one out last year. There's another one that you can find at Barnes & Noble and so forth, which incidentally, you can find my book at barnesandnoble.com and Amazon. But every year, there's a couple of books about Custer. And so whenever you write one or give a talk, you always have to kind of answer that question, why? Hasn't there been enough stuff written about him? And I think my biography tries to kind of answer that question, why people are fascinated with him and why he's been a subject of controversy and interest for well over 125 years. And you can see there's your Custer statue in Monroe, Michigan, and it shows him at probably the height of his military career at the Battle of Gettysburg. But even at the Battle of Gettysburg and the successes he had in the Civil War, he wasn't really that significant of a military figure that we'd be talking about him for 100 years, yet he is. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology did an algorithm where they tried to measure the fame of historical figures. And don't ask me how they did it, I'm not a numbers guy, but the algorithm, they broke up historical figures into category. And for military figures, Custer is the 90th most well-known in history, all of history. And they were going back to antiquity, to Julius Caesar and so forth. And when they ran the numbers for American military figures, Custer was the fourth most famous of all time. And this includes people, in World War II, like George S. Patton and so forth, through all of America's wars. And so again, why is he so famous? I think one of the reasons is that he had this artistic sensibility. He was a creator. He lived his life as kind of a dramatic story, and he knew how to promote himself. And then he also, why study different historical figures? Well, we can always learn from the past, from the failures and the successes of historical figures. And historical figures who have great failures, like Custer did the Little Bighorn, provide great lessons because, if nothing else, they provide us a lesson in humility, how we all can have great successes and then fall to failures. It also tells the story of the United States. We know how we got to be the country we are by studying historical figures. And, history is just plain fun, if you have a good story to tell or to write about. And I think Custer's life is just, a plain interesting story. But the theme that I have is not that he was interesting necessarily just for the military career, but also that he had this aspect of creativity and an artist. And he was not really destined necessarily to be a military figure. I mean, we look at historical uh, people and we think that, well, they always were a general or a president or what have you. But if you look at one of the first pictures, if not the first ever taken of Custer as a young man before he entered West Point, you can see him with kind of a dreamy look on his face and maybe envisioning many different futures for himself. And, he was uh, not necessarily, again, thinking of a career in the military. Um, he was the son of a blacksmith in a small Ohio town, New Rumley. And in the 19th century, a lot of people just followed in their father's footsteps and went into the same family trade. But Custer's family saw something special in him and went the extra mile to kind of get him a little bit more education than people got in the frontier, which Ohio was kind of on the frontier in those days, and sent him to live with an older sister in Monroe, Michigan. And that became his adopted hometown when he moved there around as an early teenager and went to the Stebbins Academy there and got a better education than his siblings with the hope that maybe he could go beyond, say, being a blacksmith or a tradesman or something like that. And he actually decided to set a career on teaching and went to the McNeely School in Hopedale, Ohio. And that's a picture of the school there. And it was called a normal school, which means that they studied norms or standards for teaching. And he was studying to be a teacher. And I did a lot of research for the book in Monroe at the County Museum, looking at the archives and the library in town. And they have a fascinating copy of a notebook that Custer kept as a student at Hopedale. And it talks about, he made notes to himself about how to be a teacher and how to hold students' attention. And anyone who's ever taught classes or been involved in teaching knows that it's a really creative art. You have to create the lesson plans with imagination, and then you also have to be a performer to hold the students' attention. And Custer, by all accounts of his teaching career of a year or two, did a good job at that. Students remembered that he would play the accordion in the morning to get students going. He would wrestle with the boys, tease the girls, play with the kids, and did all kinds of things to try to keep the students' attention. And he was actually, heading for a career in education. But as I said, Custer was ambitious and he wanted more, wanted to go to college. And for a man in his class in society, the best way to get a free education in the 19th century was to go to one of the military academies. And it was not uncommon at all for young men, if they had ambition, but didn't have the money or the social connections to go to four-year school, to go to one of the military academies. For example, U.S. Grant, the son of a tanner, didn't necessarily want to be a career military officer, but his family wanted something more for him, and getting college education at West Point was kind of the way out of town. And Custer definitely saw West Point as that, and wrote letters to family saying, that he would save his money, and after college and serving in the military for a few years, he might go into business, or he might go into education and be a college professor or a school superintendent or something like this. So he wasn't necessarily destined for the career in the military. And his career at West Point, as he wrote, was really just an example for other people not to follow, because Custer saw the military academy as kind of a fun place to go to college, and was often leaving campus to go on drinking at a local tavern called Benny Haven's, and engaged in all kinds of different pranks at the school, was kind of a class clown. And a lot of Custer biographers have written about that and said, well, he wasn't really a very good student, or he wasn't very bright, or this or that, or he had no sense of discipline, because he was always skating close to being expelled from the academy by collecting what they called demerits or bad marks. And also his grades were very low. But I kind of look at that and see him as, again, this kind of a reflection of his artistic personality, kind of a rebelliousness, creativity, not really, necessarily fitting in with the rules, and wanting to have, a good time as a college student. But the thing was that he did graduate. And this in itself, even as the bottom of the class, was quite an achievement in 19th century America. And, again, would he have stayed in the military had there not been a Civil War? We'll never know. But he was in the graduating class that was commissioned just as the war was starting. And so he entered, the biggest war in American history, and his destiny was kind of sealed in that sense. Custer's military career during the Civil War developed a reputation for him as being kind of lucky, being kind of like, I don't know, a Forrest Gump figure, where he always seemed to be in the right place at the right time. And some other Army officers, kind of disparagingly called it Custer's luck. And I always think about it, was it luck, or was he kind of authoring his own story and kind of taking advantage of moments or situations that he was placed in? It wasn't so much as luck, but him taking center stage and taking advantage of it. One thing that happened really early in his military career, he was serving as an aide for various officers at different times. And during the Peninsula Campaign in 1862, the Union Army was trying to find a crossing place across the Chickahominy River, a fording place. And he was with, a general named John Bernard, I believe. And they were at the bank of the river. And the general was kind of trying to, figure out, is it deep enough or shallow enough rather to cross? And so he turns to Custer and says, jump in. And I always found this kind of a fascinating story. You're at the bank of a river in kind of a swampy area in Virginia. There's got to be water moccasins there. There's probably rebel soldiers on the other side who might shoot you if you start wading across the river. And, who knows, maybe there's a current or something that'll sweep you downstream. You don't know how deep it is. You're supposed to just walk in there and find out. And I was thinking, why wouldn't you just say to the general, well, I'll ride across, or just kind of start riding the horse? But Custer slipped off his horse and actually started walking across the river, and it was captured by a combat artist named Alfred Wadd, who drew that picture of Custer. And as he waded across the stream, the water got, up to his chest, and he had to carry his sword and his pistol over his head to walk across and find out that, it was a fording place. And he walked all the way across the river to the other side. Bernard is yelling at him to come back. You don't have to go that far, but he goes to the other bank, walks around, sees where the Confederate pickets are, kind of sneaks up on them and walks back and has a full report. Well, when this report goes to the head of the Union Army at the time, George McClellan, he's fascinated that this young officer waded across the river and wants to see Custer. Custer shows up all muddy from having waded the Chickahominy, and McClellan puts him on his staff. So Custer goes from being, just, graduating from West Point and a year in the Army, perhaps at most, to being aide to the general in charge of the Union war effort. And it was such a fascinating story that it went the rounds around the military, and other officers talked about it and embellished the story. There was one version that McClellan was at the river site and said, I wonder how deep the water is. And Custer yells from the back, I'll damn sure show you, and then rides his horse across dramatically. That's not really the way it happened, but it's kind of an example of, Custer was there, he took advantage of it, seized the moment, and then was talked about forever after. Custer was always, kind of trying to seek center stage, be the center of attention. And one example that I think is a little bit humorous, there's a very famous photograph, which you see there, of Lincoln and McClellan. And McClellan is, I don't know, maybe the fifth officer or fourth from the left, kind of short compared to Lincoln. And they're meeting after the Battle of Antietam. And Custer is an aide, and he's pictured the last man way on the right-hand side, kind of away. He was a captain and aide and wasn't really supposed to be in the group with the generals and the presidents. But 19th century photography, the shutter speed, very slow. you had to be still for a picture to be captured. You can tell if you look closely. I don't know if you can quite see it on the slide, but Custer's legs are kind of ghosted, kind of suggesting he was kind of inching his way, trying to get closer to the center of the photograph with the president and the commander of the army. So Custer, again, always, kind of trying to be center stage, I think. Um, as I said earlier, he was an aide to many different generals in the first couple of years of the war. At the Battle of Williamsburg, he was with Winfield Scott Hancock and witnessed Hancock get in trouble because he had taken his unit too far forward. Hancock had moved his unit to seize some forward positions near Williamsburg and got orders to pull back. But instead of moving back, Hancock was convinced that this was a valuable position to hold, and he kept sending messengers back to his commanding officer asking to clarify the orders or revise the orders. And he kept doing this until it was too late and the rebels showed up and he was going to be attacked. And Custer is witnessing all this going on and wrote about it years later when he's starting his Civil War memoirs, and said he admired Hancock for taking the stand that he did and realizing that he was actually in a bit of trouble, and that if he'd lost the upcoming battle, he'd lost his complete reputation. And Custer thought, if I was ever in that situation, I would rather die on the battlefield than be dishonored. And Hancock did the right thing, staying and fighting. And he also admired Hancock being able to be cool under pressure and give orders. And as the rebels were attacking, Hancock rode slowly up and down the lines, telling the men to aim low and hold their fire until the rebels were within range. And when the first volley from the Union troops had driven the rebels back, then Hancock calmly said, "Gentlemen, charge with the bayonets." And it was a vivid memory for Custer of how to conduct yourself on the battlefield. But Custer also was involved in a lot of close combat. And this is another photograph that's been reproduced a lot in Custer biographies and also stories about dogs and war and that kind of thing. And it shows Custer early in his military career with a pet while he's in camp in Virginia. And the interesting thing to me about the photograph is if you look at Custer closely, it really shows the strain of the hard service he's going through and the combat that he's experiencing. I mean, his clothes are just hanging on him. And if you look at his face, he looks like he's got kind of this vacant stare, kind of like the cliche of a veteran having the 1,000-yard stare. And Custer at this time had killed at least one man in close combat. And he wrote a very detailed letter of it to his older sister, Ann Reed, in Monroe. And it was a skirmish between Confederate cavalry and Union cavalry. And the Union troopers were pursuing the rebels. And Custer came close to a rebel officer and yelled at him to surrender. And the rebel kept riding on and trying to get away. And Custer rode and got closer to him and said, "Surrender, I'm going to shoot." And the rebel kept riding. And so Custer shot him and knocked him off the horse. And Custer kept riding on and continued the battle. And when it was over, he went back to where the officer was and talked to some other Union soldiers who'd seen what had happened and asked how the man had died, because Custer wasn't sure he had killed him. All he knew was that he had shot him. And they said, well, he, raised up one final time, raised his hands over his head and, spit out blood and then died. It was a pretty dramatic story for Custer to hear. And Custer took the officer's sword and Morocco saddle as trophies of war, and then went back to camp and wrote this long letter to his sister describing what had happened and chasing this guy across the battlefield and the thrill of combat, and that he had taken this trophy. And then he said, it was his own fault because I asked him to surrender and he refused, and that's why I had to kill him. And so a number of people have written about this and said, well, this shows Custer had kind of a vicious character, that he enjoyed war as kind of a sport. But if you read his sister's reply to him, it seems very different, because his sister wrote back and said, I'm so sorry to hear that you had to kill that man. And, no, it was upsetting, but it was your duty and you had no choice in the situation you were in. And so it was kind of like she's trying to comfort him, and had understood that his letter to her was kind of a rationalization or a retelling of the story. And if you read about the psychology of the effects on combat, there's always the initial euphoria of having survived or triumphed. But then later on, frequently comes feelings of guilt and the need to kind of justify and why you had to kill somebody in combat. And I think Custer was just like most other veterans, and was actually kind of wrestling with a lot of the stuff that he had seen and participated in during the Civil War. But he was no doubt a successful combat officer, and was noticed by Alfred Pleasanton, who he was serving as an aide. And Pleasanton was head of the Union Cavalry, and in a reorganization, he promoted Custer and a couple of young officers, jumped them up the ranks. Custer went from captain, I believe, to brigadier general. Quite a jump, and it was a way to make the cavalry more active. And here's a picture of Custer shortly after he was promoted, and Pleasanton is second from the right seated. Custer is at the far right seated, and you can see how Custer's uniform is different from those of the other officers. And Custer created his own uniform. They were a little bit looser with regulations then. And when he was promoted, he had his aide rummage through his trunk and find some clothes to make a dramatic outfit. And he's got a velvet jacket with all this extra gold braiding on the sleeves. And it's not a color photograph, so you can't see, but he's has a Union sailor suit that's light blue, shirt rather, that the collar comes out over his black jacket. And he's wearing a red necktie, which his soldiers then later adopted as kind of a symbol of the regiment and kind of a feeling of morale and unity. And it actually is something that Custer learned while he was an aide to another Civil War general earlier in the war, Phil Kearney, who invented what was called the Kearney Patch, a red triangle that he had his soldiers sew on their caps so that he could recognize them when they were intermingled with other units, and also create kind of an esprit de corps. And so that was one of the things that Custer was doing, focusing on the importance of the theatricality, the show, and so forth, but also for a very logical reason to increase morale. As I said earlier, Gettysburg, the statue that you have in Monroe there, arguably was the height of Custer's military career. In fact, some revisionist historians in the last 5-6 years or so have argued that Custer actually saved the Union at the Civil War, that if you go to the Gettysburg battlefield, you can see the spot where the nation was saved during the Civil War. And it wasn't necessarily Pickett's charge it was turned back, but at what's called the East Cavalry Field, which is a couple of miles removed from the main battlefield of Gettysburg. If you've ever been there, the main battlefield where they had Pickett's charge and all the infantry battles, there's monuments, it seems like every square foot. But you have to drive a couple of miles away from the battlefield to see where Custer and the Union and Confederate cavalry fought. And there's just the one monument there in the middle of the field honoring the Union cavalry, where they turned back a Confederate attack. And you can see in the top photo the area from where the Confederates were attacking and how barren it is today. Not many people even go to see it. But the argument of some historians, and probably the majority, think that the cavalry field wasn't that significant. But others believe, and I tend to kind of fall into this camp, that the cavalry battle was actually rather significant. The argument is that while the Confederates were attacking the Union center with Pickett's charge on the final day of Gettysburg, the Confederate cavalry was trying to get behind the Union lines. And had they gotten behind there, perhaps they could have caused chaos, caused the Union Army to retreat, maybe even allowed Pickett's charge or an attack to work, and allowed the Southerners to win the battle. One of the main arguments is that, well, there was no coordination. There's no evidence that the attacks were coordinated, or that if the Confederates had won the cavalry battle, that they would have won the battle as a whole. And of course, we'll never know now, but we do know that it was a ferocious battle and that they had been charging and countercharging for the day. And then at the last ultimate part of the battle, the Confederates threw in all of their cavalry, and it looked like the Union forces would be overrun, but Custer took a fresh unit, the last one the Union troopers had left, yelled, "Come on, you Wolverines," and led a charge, meeting the Confederates, and they met in the middle of the field, crashing, as one participant said, with the noise of timber falling, horses running into each other and knocking riders end over end, and cannonballs exploding, and rifles going off, and just this huge, massive collision. The Confederates retreated, and at least in this portion of the field, well, the whole battle, the Union was victorious, but again, this portion of the field, they had turned the Confederates back from getting behind the Union lines. One of the interesting things about the press coverage of the Battle of Gettysburg is that this portion of the field, the cavalry battle, was hardly covered at all. Gettysburg was one of the most thoroughly covered battles of the war. There were probably close to 100 reporters covering the fight, but almost all of them were with the infantry and with the Union officers. There were no reporters on Custer's part of the battlefield, so no one was there to witness it, and most of the subsequent stories mentioned it hardly at all. And a number of the veterans felt that they had been shortchanged because they weren't written about in the press. And so one of the questions is, if a reporter had been there or two and written about this, would our interpretation of Gettysburg be different and more people be inclined to think that Custer had a key role in the battle? Who knows? But it didn't happen that way. It was largely uncovered, and today, it's not really a major part of the whole Gettysburg Park. Custer's fame instead came later as the Union cavalry became more active, more successful, more raids, and Custer proved to be just really good coverage. He knew how to work the press from his experience serving with McClellan, who was an expert at contacting reporters, getting favorites, feeding them stories. And Custer had a guy from the New York Times named E.A. Paul who followed him around, to the point that another cavalry officer, kind of a rival of Custer's, said Paul was Custer's pet reporter. And Custer knew how to give a good story. He knew how to write a story and how to give a story to reporters. One example, I read a story in a newspaper in New Jersey where Custer told the New Jersey reporter how well the New Jersey troops under his command had done, and talked at length about that. So that Custer's dramatic look with his long hair, the New York newspaper started calling him the boy general of the golden locks. So he's kind of a natural. And in 1864, he made the cover of Harper's Weekly with the image you see there. Became very famous after leading part of a cavalry raid towards Richmond. The main part of the raid was led by a general named Judson Kilpatrick, nicknamed satirically by his men Kill Cavalry. And Kilpatrick, as part of the raid, was a failure. But Custer's diversionary raid turned out to be a big success, although he wasn't the main part of the raid. Took a lot of prisoners, burned several bridges and so forth, and got a lot of press coverage for that raid, and then subsequently serving under Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley and a number of Union victories there. Custer gradually became a celebrity. At the same time, around the same time, he got married, he had been dating for a couple of years, courting Libby Bacon of Monroe. She was the daughter of a judge in town. Custer, as I said, was the son of a blacksmith. Libby's father wasn't really crazy about the courtship and declined to give his permission or endorsement of the marriage for a while, engagement. But then finally, as Custer's fame grew and grew, he gave in to Libby's pleas and permitted Custer to marry his daughter. In addition to having romantic marriage, they also were partners in a sense. They also had shared this kind of artistic sensibility. Libby was a writer herself and won an award for her writing while she was in school, and helped with Custer's career when she was in DC, talking to congressmen, met Lincoln a couple of times and always talked up her husband, and also kept a book of Custer's newspaper clippings. So both of them together were aware of publicity and interested in promoting his career, and they shared, again, an interest in the arts, loved to go to plays, and Libby became a successful author after Custer's death. At the time of the end of the Civil War, the surrender of Lee's army at Appomattox Courthouse, Custer again was, the center of attention, whether it was, you could say it was Custer's luck, or again, he was just a good officer, and his unit was the one that actually had helped trap Lee's army when it was trying to escape from the siege of Petersburg. And Custer actually received the first flag of truce from the Confederate Army because he had his troops lined up and ready to attack one last time. And that's another combat artist drew that picture of Custer getting the flag of truce. He wrote a letter right away to Libby saying, "Thank God the war is over and peace is at hand," and explained to her he was going to, be demoted as the army was demobilized after the war and reduced in size, but at least they would have each other. And it's kind of an interesting how he had grown during the war. At the beginning, he was excited about being in the war. He written one letter home saying that he could have a battle every day of his life, that it was so exciting. By the end of the war, he's just glad it's over. And so Custer faces peacetime and what to do next with his life, as so many other veterans had at the end of the Civil War. And for Custer, he was thinking about something else. He'd always been interested in politics. His father was involved in local politics in New Rumley, Ohio. And Custer took a foray into politics, going on a campaign swing with Andrew Johnson, the President of the United States. Johnson called it the swing around the circle. When I was speaking to her through the East and the upper Midwest, and invited a couple of generals to kind of boost his image, he persuaded Grant to go on the trip for part of the way, and also wanted Custer to go as a charismatic young figure. Custer really didn't give speeches on the trip other than just, to say he was for the restoration of the Union and that kind of thing. And they were trying to boost, again, a favorable result in midterm elections that year. And Custer actually got into it with a crowd in Ohio that was critical of Johnson and booing him. And Custer said, "I'm from Ohio and I'm ashamed of the way you people are treating the president." And he left the tour shortly after that. But he did participate in a soldiers and sailors political convention that summer to, again, drum up support for Johnson's ideas and having a quick end to Reconstruction and reunion of the states. He didn't give a lot of speeches at the convention, although he was one of the organizers. He was usually just on the stage while other folks were speaking. But at the end of the convention, the crowd started to chant, and they wanted a speech from Custer, and they're chanting, Custer, Custer, Custer. And he just stands up and shakes his head and walks slowly around the stage, kind of back and forth. And the crowd is getting more in a fever pitch as they're seeing Custer walk around, but he's not speaking, and yelling his name louder and wanting a speech. And Custer just shakes his head and keeps walking around. And then all of a sudden, as the crowd is getting its loudest, he turns around and runs as fast as he can to the front of the stage and raises his fist and yells, 3 cheers for the old flag. And the crowd went absolutely nuts, because the reference to the old flag meant we're going to restore the Union. It's going to be the flag that was before the Civil War, and all the states will be together and we'll have harmony. And a reporter who was there and witnessed this, a guy for the Boston Transcript, who was not a fan of either Andrew Johnson or Custer for that matter, wrote kind of grudgingly, he saw how Custer led so many successful charges during the Civil War and got men to follow him, that he had this kind of undefinable charisma and sense of timing, and knew how to play a crowd and get people behind him and excite them. And that for the instant, whatever he is doing, he is the thing he does, that he's caught up in the moment. And to me, when I read that story, I was thinking, yeah, that's just, what Custer was, a performer. Again, kind of an artist. He had this sense of timing and how to get people's attention. But Custer decided, excuse me, not to run for office that year, although he had offers from both parties wanting him to run for Congress from Michigan. Libby didn't want him to get into politics, particularly after the disaster of the swing around the circle where Johnson was criticized so thoroughly. So Custer, when he received an appointment to serve in Kansas with the 7th Cavalry, he decided to stay in the military for a while longer. But the campaign in Kansas was a disaster militarily. He was serving under Winfield Scott Hancock, and this time Hancock didn't quite know how to do frontier warfare, and his mission was actually just to show the flag, to impress the Plains tribes with the power of the military, so they would stop occasional raiding and horse stealing and that kind of thing. But instead, he came with an attitude of trying to intimidate them. And when the Indians abandoned a village and their teepees because they were fearful that the soldiers were going to attack them, Hancock ordered the village burned. And there you go, is a drawing from a combat artist showing Custer at the burning of the village. And what it did, instead of intimidate the tribes, instead of inflame them, and there was open warfare throughout Kansas and Colorado and all over the Plains states. And Custer spent the summer basically marching around the area, trying to catch up with raiders, but always showing up after a raid had been done, where a stagecoach station had been burned and the employees killed, or a farmhouse burned, or what have you, and a small detachment of soldiers carrying messages, or what have you, would be killed by warriors. And so he got frustrated, and then left his troopers at a fort in western Kansas, and then took 100 troopers with him for an escort and went to the eastern part of the state, ostensibly to pick up supplies, but also to see Libby, who he knew was somewhere at one of the eastern forts, and he knew that there was a cholera outbreak, and he wanted to make sure that Libby was all right. But the upshot was that he was court-martialed for leaving his command without permission, and then also for ordering some deserters shot without holding a trial, because he had had a huge problem with desertions, soldiers leaving to go into Colorado to work in the mines or other jobs, and at one point was losing as much as a third of his command while he was in an active war zone. He was found guilty and sentenced to a year without pay. And, for the first time in his military career, basically, he's getting negative coverage for his actions in warfare. In the Civil War, it had all been positive coverage, but here it was kind of split. Some newspapers wrote that Custer was made a scapegoat for a failed campaign that was costing the government $150,000 a year, and Hancock had shifted the blame to Custer. Other folks felt that Custer's punishment was too light for what he had done. In fact, U.S. Grant had said that the punishment should have been harsher in view of what he was found guilty of. But Custer, again, after the Civil War, he's thinking again of possibly a new career. And he had written some magazine articles at that point and decided that he would go back to Monroe and spend his suspension working on his Civil War memoirs. So again, he's kind of vacillating between what he's going to do. Will he stay in the military or not? But while he's up there, he's reading about campaigns on the plains and the military's failed effort to end this war in the Plains states. And he's missing the camaraderie of his troopers and being on the trail. And his former boss, Phil Sheridan, who he had served with in the Shenandoah, is in charge of this military district of the United States. And after a couple of failed conventional efforts, he decides that a winter campaign would be the way to impress the tribes and to capture a village. Because the idea is that in the dead of a plains winter, the Indians wouldn't be able to be so mobile. Their horses, ponies would be weak from lack of eating grass and so forth, and they'd be just hunkered down for the winter. Jim Bridger, a plainsman, had told Sheridan that he was crazy to try to get troopers to go on a campaign in the middle of winter. But for Custer, again, kind of thinking outside the box, I think this is part of his artistic personality. He thought this was a great idea to try something like this. And so when Sheridan got his suspension lifted, Custer was out heading to the Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma, and planning this campaign. And they took off in the middle of a blizzard that had dumped 12 inches of snow on the ground. And using some Osage scouts, they were able to find a trail of a war party, they thought, that led to a village on the Washita River. And Custer divided his force into 4 columns, attacked from 4 sides at dawn, and quickly seized this village. He killed a number of warriors, some civilians as well, and then took 50 or so Indian women and children as prisoners, and was able to bring them back to the base camp and achieve the first real victory that the Army had had in this campaign. It had been able to seize a village. One of the chiefs who was killed in the initial attack was a man named Black Kettle, and also his wife. And in one of the great tragedies of American history, Black Kettle had actually been at the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado a couple of years previously and had witnessed an attack there where Colorado militia had wantonly killed women and children. And then a couple of years later, he's in a village that is attacked by the military. Again, Custer is vilified and then also lionized in the press, depending upon the newspaper's viewpoint and the public opinion. A number of people were angry, said that Black Kettle was a peace chief, that there was no reason to attack this village, and that Custer and Sheridan both were doing the same things they had done in the Civil War, burning civilians' homes and destroying crops, and they were doing the same things to the Plains tribes. And of course, that was exactly their idea. Just as in the Civil War, the goal was to bring the war home to the civilian population and get them to stop fighting. Sheridan's idea here was to bring the war home to the Indian villages and get them to stop fighting. So that was their plan. But again, a lot of people felt it crossed the line, and particularly were saddened by the death of Black Kettle. Other folks, other newspapers wrote that, well, the tribes were attacking civilian homesteads, stage stations, and had asked for a war, and now the army had given them the war, good and hard, was a quote in one of the New Mexico newspapers. But again, Custer is kind of a controversial figure in his own time after the Battle of the Washita. Controversial, but yet he has reinvented himself as a frontiersman. That one picture from the previous slide showed him in the buckskins and the long beard and how he had dressed for the winter campaign. And he, again, while he was serving on the plains, frequently wore the buckskins outfit. And so instead of the outlandish cavalier outfit during the Civil War, now he's kind of frontiersman. And he became a celebrity at Fort Hays. After the Washita, there was not much action. He spent a couple of years entertaining visitors who had come to Fort Hays to see the great general and go on a buffalo hunt. And a number of celebrities came, including P.T. Barnum, who was the founder of the famous circus, came out and hunted buffalo with Custer. And then probably the most famous guest he had was the picture that you see on this slide, which is the Grand Duke Alexis, the son of the Tsar of Russia, who was on a goodwill tour of the United States and said that the one thing he wanted to do in the United States was go on a buffalo hunt. Custer actually at this point had been assigned to Elizabethtown, Kentucky. He was there to buy horses for the army. So he's no longer in Kansas. But Sheridan, I hope you can't hear my dog barking, but somebody may be walking in the front yard or something. But anyway, Sheridan wanted somebody to lead a celebrity buffalo hunt. Who's the best guy to do that in the army? Well, it's Custer. And so he was called from Kentucky to go back to Kansas and lead this hunt for the son of the Tsar. And he and the Grand Duke got along so well, they became good friends and corresponded. And later on, when Custer was killed, the Grand Duke sent money to Libby to help her in her widowhood. So Custer is now a celebrity and kind of again exploring different options for his life. In 1873, he was assigned to the Dakota Territory, to Fort Abraham Lincoln. And you can see here a larger version of the picture that is on the cover of the book. And these two photographs show Custer in his office at Fort Abraham Lincoln. And for the first time in his life, he actually had his own real permanent home. At West Point, he was living in the cadet dorm. While he was on campaign during the Civil War, he was usually living in tents. When he was serving on the plains at Fort Hays, for a long time, he was in a tent while they were building that fort. And then the housing at Fort Hays was never really very elaborate. And the other forts in Kansas, not really, good quarters. But in the new fort in the Dakota Territory, the house was designed to Custer's specifications. They had a commander's house, but a fire burned it down. And then Custer got to help design the new home. And he picked out specifically an office space. And on the plans for the new home, he had his office and wrote in all caps, "My room." And this was going to be the room where he would work. And the interesting thing is, again, if you look at the photo, it looks like a writer's office. I mean, he's got piles of newspapers, books. The papers that he's working on are spread on his desk. Libby usually sat with him while he wrote. He liked to have her there to kind of help him if he came to a sense of writer's block or what have you. If he couldn't get going, she would ask him pointed questions to kind of develop his thinking and get his writing going again. But I think it's an example, again, of how he was thinking of himself as not necessarily an Army officer, but a writer. I mean, you can see how, photography at that time was difficult to do. I mean, the cameras were very bulky. It took a lot of setup. The shutter speed was slow. So you had to kind of plan the photos. And what's fascinating to me is a photographer has come out to the fort to photograph the general. Custer doesn't pose on his horse like he did in one or two photographs in the Civil War, or he doesn't pose in some kind of a martial setting with the troops or something like that, but instead has his photograph taken in his office while he's writing. And I think that gives an idea of his sense of self at that point in his life. He had a couple of missions while he was at Fort Abraham Lincoln, led a couple of expeditions, one to the Yellowstone, one through the Black Hills. Um, and that photograph is of him with a grizzly bear that he had shot, which was his proudest hunting moment, that he had killed the king of the bears. And had a photograph of himself taken with the trophy. And yeah, again, it's kind of part of his image is not necessarily a military officer, but a great hunter and a frontiersman and that kind of thing. The expedition to the Black Hills led to the Little Bighorn because they discovered gold on this expedition, and they discovered gold at a time that the United States was going through a tremendous recession. The government then couldn't keep people from going into the Black Hills, which were owned by the Sioux. We didn't have enough troopers to keep them out, and the troopers weren't that motivated to try and police the miners anyway. And so there was quite a bit of conflict between the Sioux and the miners. The government tried to purchase the Black Hills, but the Sioux did not want to sell them. They were sacred land, valued them highly. And so the government, Grant administration, basically kind of started a war by ordering the Sioux that were off the reservation and out camping in the middle of winter, hunkered down for the winter, to leave their camps and come back and report to their various agencies. Well, they couldn't do that in the middle of winter, even if they'd wanted to, and they saw no reason that they would have to do that. But a deadline was set for January 31st. When they didn't come back, the government declared them hostile and then sent out the military to force the tribes back on the reservation. This probably, in Custer's mind, I think was going to be his one final campaign. These two photographs, it's kind of interesting to me the way I placed them here, because the large photo is one of the last taken of Custer in 1876 in his dress uniform. But he's kind of like dreaming of a civilian life. And that's another photograph taken about the same time when he went on leave to New York and was visiting with publishers and politicians. And Custer actually at this time is planning a speaking tour. He's negotiating with the Red Path Agency, which was the agency that handled Mark Twain's speaking tours. And they offered Custer basically a fortune to go on a speaking tour, about $500,000 in today's money for about 6 months' work giving speeches. And he's working on his Civil War memoirs. He's actually writing while he's on the campaign trail on the expedition towards the Little Bighorn. So he's got his thoughts in other places, and this probably would be his last campaign, although we'll never know what would have happened. The Army's plan was to have 3 columns converge. They weren't sure exactly where the Indian village was that they were seeking, but they knew it was somewhere in the middle of the Montana, Dakota area. And as I'm getting close to the end of time, I know I'll try to pick up the pace a little bit here, but long story short, Custer's column found the village first. And Custer's plan apparently was similar to what he had at the Washita, that he would attack the village from different directions. He planned to launch a surprise attack, but he mistakenly thought he was discovered when they found some Indians on their back trail, and they thought they had come from the village, but they had not. But anyway, he felt he had to attack immediately, because everybody in the Army, not just Custer, but Sheridan and everybody else, their main goal was to find the village. and capture it before it could move. They didn't really have the mindset that they thought the tribes would stand and fight. But on that day, they were strong enough. It was one of the largest villages ever assembled on the continent, and they stood and fought. And Custer's attack failed, as we all know. The unit that attacked first um, came up short. The attack broke very quickly. Custer went around to the other end of the village, probably trying to get into the village, tried to take prisoners like he had done at the Washita, but he was completely overwhelmed by numbers. And every man that was on the part of the field with him was killed, about 200 soldiers, roughly. And the last group of 50 or so wound up on what's called Last Stand Hill, which you can see today if you go to the battlefield, and there's a marker for where Custer fell. He's not actually buried there. He's buried at West Point, but they have markers for all of the soldiers that they can identify the bodies where they found them. The battle created huge news and throughout the country. As JJ had said earlier, I'd written a book about this, Shooting Arrows, Slinging Mud. And that's also easily available on Amazon if you're interested at all. It's hard for us today to even imagine a news story like this that had hit in 1876. We don't really have generals that are quite celebrities as the way Custer was at that time, and certainly not celebrities and also commanding combat units and actively engaged in combat, nor do I think we can imagine a famous military unit like the 82nd Airborne being completely destroyed by the Taliban in Afghanistan or something like that. It's just kind of beyond thought. And that was what it was like for Americans in 1876. Plus, it was during centennial celebrations for the 100th anniversary of the country. Plus, it was in a presidential election year. And so, as you can imagine, it became a political football. Republicans blamed Custer for being rash. Democrats blamed the Grant administration for keeping troops on reconstruction duty in the South instead of having them on the plains with Custer. And so all of the first news stories, the first draft of history, it was all very biased and no really very objective analysis. And it's become a debate down to this day about what really happened. And was Custer to blame? Was he rash? Or, were there other factors at the battle? And the controversy again started in the news coverage in the weeks immediately after the battle. As I said before, Libby Custer became an author in her own right, and she wrote 3 books about Custer, all sold quite well, about her life with him, and really kept his memory alive and acted almost as kind of a PR agent for him. And she lived a long time, till 1933. And there's a picture of her unveiling the statue, standing now in Monroe with President William Howard Taft, who came to give a speech about it. And she went on a lot of trips, moved to New York, went on a speaking tour, the tour that Custer, a type of tour that Custer was planning at the time of his death. And so she really helped to enlarge his memory over the 50, 60 years after the battle until her death. She lived long enough to even consult with movie companies about making movies about Custer and the Little Bighorn. Custer today, then, his reputation since the 1930s, and there was an extremely negative biography about him called Glory Hunter in 1934, and there have been many negative biographies since then. His popularity has kind of ebbed and flowed with trends in American history. Right now, we seem to be at a particular point where we're really examining a lot of heroes in American history, not just Custer, but also even Lincoln, Grant, George Washington, you name it. Everybody's really being re-examined with a particularly critical light. I think in terms of Custer, it's again interesting to note the different things that he did, and he had various factors of his life. And JJ and I were talking earlier that there's nobody in American history who's really a saint. I mean, everybody has good and bad, and certainly Custer did. But he had a lot of accomplishments during his life. He was a successful soldier. He was a writer. He was a school teacher, remained fascinated with education his whole life. At one point applied to be the commandant of cadets at West Point, wanted to go back there and run the academy. And had he lived, he could have done many other things. He could have run for president. He wasn't going to run in 1876. That's kind of a myth that's been created afterwards. The nominees already, were selected. But he was a young man and he lived. He certainly could have run in 1880 or 1884 or later. Civil War veterans were elected, for the next several presidential elections. So certainly he could have, uh, you know, campaigned. He certainly had the connections. He could have been an actor like his friend Buffalo Bill. Um, he was very interested in the theater. He could have performed in shows of one kind or another. Certainly he was planning that speaking tour. And he could have just stayed in the Army. He never could quite bring himself to leave it. And had he done so, he might have risen to command of the Army like one of his comrades from the Civil War, Nelson Miles, did. Um, but anyway, he's always going to be a fascinating character. And I think the main thing is, excuse me, the main reason is because, again, he had this kind of soul of an artist and he had a talent for promotion, for telling a good story, and for living a good story. So um, that's probably enough for Custer right now. I understand we might go to a Q&A, JJ, or
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I want to thank you for sharing all that with us. We have a number of different perspectives in the question and answer section, and time permitting, we're going to make sure we get to them all. But I just want to remind all of you who have asked questions that we do want to keep the discussion on topic as possible. So, on the figure at hand, George Armstrong Custer and his role in history. So I'll start off. The first person to type a question was Richard Micka, and he asked about the opportunity that monuments may present for learning, specifically the Custer Equestrian Monument in Monroe. Do they present an opportunity for learning? What are your thoughts on that?
I think most certainly they do. Um, in a number of ways. I mean, for one thing, you can learn about the era when they were built and what people felt was important at that time. Um, that's part of the American story. And then, monuments are a great expense. They're a great attention getter. And so, why was a particular person so important that the community felt they had to have a monument? I think that can tell us something. And monuments also, they're often done by very prominent artists and are interesting in their own way. I think about um, the where my university is in Denton, Texas. We had a Civil War monument on the town square, and in the days of Jim Crow, there were two water fountains attached to the Civil War monument to the Confederate dead from Denton County. And one, of course, was from black and one was for white for the fountains. And we had quite a lively debate about whether to remove that or not. But one of the arguments for letting it stay was to, teach us about Jim Crow and why people put this up and what segregation was about. And it's an example to study that. And you can add to it by adding an explanation. This is why this was put here. Now, if the statue is taken down, and actually the county decided to remove it, I think late last year, um, felt that it was too hurtful of a memory. But the argument that other folks had for keeping it was, again, if you have the statue there, then people can still talk about the Civil War, what caused the Civil War, slavery, Jim Crow, and all these other things, and have that discussion. You remove the statue, and then there's less of a reason perhaps to have the discussion. But at any rate, you have something like that, people can debate issues and learn about, the origin of the country.
Well, thanks for that. The next question we have is from M. Angel, and they ask, will there be a discussion on Custer refusing to lead Black soldiers or taking Indigenous women and children hostage and using them as human shields? Could you give your thoughts on that, provide a little commentary on that aspect?
Um, yeah, that's true. Custer did uh, decline a command of a Black unit at the end of the Civil War or post Civil War. He was offered that, but he was also offered the command of the regular unit in the 7th Cavalry. He chose to do that, and I think he was a product of his times and felt that he would not have prestige commanding um, the Black unit. I think that's why he chose to do that. As far as taking the hostages, he did take prisoners at the Washita. And again, that's, if you're in a battle, you're going to take prisoners. They were civilians. He probably, the 7th Cavalry probably would have been overrun at the Washita had they not had those prisoners.
All right, thanks for the commentary for sure.
All
Um,
right. Oh,
got one, Andy? Go ahead.
yeah, I'll go to someone named Anonymous Attendee. I read that Custer was court-martialed because he deserted his post when an epidemic of diphtheria broke out and he ran to Libby, not because he was frustrated at not catching natives and leaving. Which source are you using to state this information?
No, I said both. I said that there was not diphtheria, but I think it was a cholera outbreak. Um, when he arrived at, I think it was Fort Harker in Western Kansas, um, he wrote that the fort was basically under siege. It had no supplies. Um, no supplies were forthcoming. There was a lot of trouble getting um, supplies, communication from one end of the state to the other because of the raiding. And so his argument was that he would go personally to get the supplies. But of course, that was kind of, a self-serving argument in the sense that he also had the other thing he wanted to do, which was to see if his wife was safe. He knew that she was supposed to come meet him, but he wasn't sure which post she was at. And so he did leave. And that's why he was charged, court-martialed with leaving his command without permission. His argument was that he was the commanding officer and he had permission from Sherman, who had told him to go to Denver or hell, wherever he needed to go to find um, enemy warriors. And so he said he had permission to go wherever he wanted. He didn't have a written order. And so he was found guilty for that, also guilty for shooting, ordering deserters shot without a trial. There's also another charge about misusing government property, wearing out the horses. And again, he was found guilty on all the charges.
Now, I'll take the next one. Thanks for the answer. Graham Denton writes that I read that Custer was killed because he assumed he was attacking a village of sleeping women and children, like at Washita. Can you confirm that through Custer's own writings, he boasted of this strategy, but eventually led to his downfall, attacking women and children instead of warriors, that is?
Well, I mean, he attacked a village that contained warriors. I mean, the warriors were living in the village. So if you attacked a village, you would be attacking civilians and also the warriors. Um, it was basically guerrilla warfare. And so in his own writings, he did explain that. Um, when he was writing about the Washita, he talked about approaching the village at night. And the Osage scouts who had led him there said that they could smell smoke from the village. But Custer and the white officers were not as attuned to the plains, and they couldn't smell the smoke, and they doubted there was a village there through this, winter storm. But then they kept listening, and they heard a dog bark, and so they figured, well, that's one sign that there's a village. And then they heard the tinkle of a bell, and well, then they figured that must be an Indian pony herd because the Indians put bells on some of the ponies. And then the last thing they heard was a baby cry. And Custer said that kind of shook everybody up because they knew there would be children in the village. But in order to capture the village, they would have to charge in there, and that likely some civilians would be killed. So, yeah, Custer admitted that in some of his writing. But I think it's important to think about the context of the times and the hard war strategy that Custer had been schooled in during the Civil War. I mean, there's a recent book about the Civil War called A Savage War, and they talk about the strategy during the Civil War, including the Shenandoah Valley, where Custer was, but also Sherman's infamous march through Georgia. And the strategy was to take the war to the civilians, to make them feel the war, as Sherman said. And it's something that the United States and the Allies also did in World War II. I mean, it's analogous to the bombing campaigns against Germany and Japan. And sure, the Allies would argue that, well, we're bombing factories and so forth. But a lot of those raids killed many, many, many civilians. And we're not even talking about Hiroshima. We're talking about the firebombing of Dresden and so forth. And the British had a campaign that was called a dehousing campaign. They were going to, destroy all the housing and break the will of the German people to fight. And I think this was the strategy that they had, the hard war strategy for the plains. And the one thing that it was different from a bombing campaign, for example, at least they weren't blatantly dropping bombs on the Indian villages and killing every single person there. Custer did take prisoners at the Washita. They did not, wantonly shoot every single person at the village. In fact, Frederick Benteen, who was a captain under Custer, was charged by an Indian boy who was about, say, 14 or something like that, and yelled at him to surrender. And the boy kept coming at him and shooting at him. And Benteen kept calling at him to surrender. And the boy kept firing shots until finally he hit Benteen's horse and was close enough. And Benteen knew if he didn't shoot the boy, he was going to be shot himself. And so he did end up killing him. But it was something that I don't think the individual soldiers in the 7th Cavalry considered a triumph. It was something that actually they did not want to do. But certainly it was, an ugly aspect of the plains warfare.
Thanks for that.
All right. Next question is going to be from Katie Beth Davis. She asked, he slaughtered women and children. Is this someone that we should be having elementary schools named after, or children's ball programs? Do you think he is good representation for all people?
What was the first part of the question? I didn't hear quite all of it.
He slaughtered women and children. Is this someone that we should be having elementary schools named after, or children's ball programs? Do you think he is a good representation for all people?
Well, I think, as we talked at the beginning and in Andrew's introduction and JJ's, historical figures are complex. And, if a community does not want a school named after a certain figure, that's certainly up to the public to rename a school uh, if the majority of the people don't feel that he's a good representative. Um, Again, I think a strong argument for Custer is that he served the country as an officer in the military um, for basically his whole life. He fought in the Civil War, which ended slavery. And Custer himself, when he was on Reconstruction duty in Texas, um, wrote home to his father about a freed slave he'd seen with whip marks on his back. And he hadn't really seen that kind of stuff in the upper South in Virginia. But in the lower South, the slaves in general were treated much more brutally, and he hadn't seen that level until he got to Texas and Louisiana. And he wrote home and said, if any good at all came out of this war, it was ending this brutality. So I think Custer did lead raids where civilians were killed, but he also uh, served the United States throughout his life. So I think you can make an argument that he was an American hero.
Well, thanks a lot for that. We're getting toward the end of our questions now, and Cole has a question, kind of perhaps more of a philosophical nature. How would you tell a Native American child, how would you explain to them that you honor someone infamous for killing their people? And a follow-up to that that captures it is, do you think public debate at the expense of indigenous comfort is worth the statue's location in our modern time? And that can be kind of a reflection of others as well. So can you give your thoughts on that?
Again, as far as the statues go, I think, again, it's up to community standards. If enough people in a community are uncomfortable with a certain historical representation, then, they should bring it down. But again, I think we need to think about historical figures in their totality, and the good and the bad things that they've done. And the plains warfare, as all warfare is, was brutal, and it was quite brutal on both sides. I mean, at the Washita, they found the body of a Kansas woman and her child who had been taken hostage by the tribes. And so there was hostage taking and wanton killing on both sides, just as there are in all wars in human history. And certainly, again, you could compare it to other wars that we've had. I mean, our pilots who flew missions in World War II and flew over Germany, are they heroes or are they villains? Um, you know, uh, Other soldiers who, fired cannons in World War II into civilian areas and civilians were killed. Are they heroes or are they villains? I don't know. Maybe we shouldn't have statues of anybody who's in the military. I mean, if you want to stretch it like that. I think the main thing is that we need to think about historical figures in the context in which they lived and the whole aspect of their lives.